Before we begin, I just want to say that the editing software that I'll be using today is Logic Pro 10, but all of the concepts that I speak about today should be accessible on any editing software that you use, whether it's GarageBand, Audacity, or something else. Any of the concepts that I speak about today should be applicable to any podcaster. The first thing that we're going to talk about here is you should notice on my screen that the name of this project is Podcast Smarter Template. And what I've done is I've just created a project within Logic Pro 10 that I always go to, that I use to edit my podcast. Now, this can have things as you see here, such as the podcast intro and outro, and it has the track of the recorded podcast. Now, a podcast template session could be a great way for you to remove the amount of editing, or rather reduce the amount of editing that you have to do for your podcast episode. So if for every single podcast episode, you're creating a brand new project, you're having to import your intro and outro, any ads that you might have that you do in this way, and you're having to edit all of the different host tracks, it is a lot of time wasted that you could be using to edit your podcast, get your podcast out, and do more to get your podcast into more eyes and ears. So creating a podcast template is something I will recommend all podcasters do right off the bat. The other thing I want to talk about here is about creating a timesheet while you're recording your podcast. We are responsible not only for recording the content, but editing the content as well, which we're talking about today. You can create a note, whether it's in your phone or on your computer, and as you see on my screen here, I have my podcast timesheet. So I can type in a couple of different timestamps as the podcast is recording so that I know that I can go back to these specific timestamps and edit some of that content there. This is a really helpful time saver when you're going back to edit. But having a podcast timesheet, make sure that if there are things that during the podcast you hear that you know you're going to have to go edit later, it becomes much easier to find those during the editing process. When you're listening back to your podcast audio, let's go ahead and see if we can identify any sorts of pause words or any kind of awkward stops during the podcast here. When I talk about pause words, what I mean by that are maybe there's a point where there's a little bit of a longer pause and the host or the interviewee says something like or something like that. Let's listen in here and see if we hear some of those pauses. Promote their podcast.
So there's a very wide variety of ways to promote.
So right there, you could hear that there was a little bit of a pause and some words, some stop words there between what I was saying and what Ronnie was saying. So what I'm going to do is, usually what I would do is I would just edit out that silence here. But we also heard some of this stumbling of the voice here.
So
what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to remove that silence, and I'm going to remove those first couple of wells. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that part of the track, the end of the track, and I'm just going to move it over to the other beginning part of the track here. And now let's hear that back and see how that sounds. Promote their podcast.
There's a very wide variety of ways to promote your podcast.
Removing that little bit of space and removing that little bit of stumbling at the beginning of the sentence creates a more cohesive audio file and a more cohesive conversation. Is there anything wrong with someone saying well and having some of those stops? Absolutely not. And in normal conversation, we often hear that from people that we're talking to. But when you're recording a podcast, there are some of those little audio cues that you can remove that just help move the conversation forward a little bit more and help from removing any distractions from the listener. You can over edit your content, absolutely. We want this to sound like a natural flowing conversation. Again, if we use this as an example here, promote their podcast.
There's a very wide variety.
It does sound like a natural conversation between myself and Ronnie. Now, if I went in and removed every single breath, if I went in and removed every single like, and well, would we be removing all those stop words and pauses? Yes. But at the same time, you run the risk of making your podcast sound a little too robotic. One thing is to have distractions in your podcast that you're removing. The other thing is to make it sound like a hodgepodge of audio files put together. The more natural you can get your podcast to sound, the better. So for example, right here around the 20, let's say 23, 25 second mark.
Personal bandwidth, of course. For example.
So right there, it seems like you can hear the person thinking, which ultimately isn't always a bad thing, but listen to this.
Personal bandwidth, of course.
If I go ahead and remove a little bit of that here, including some of that silence and some of those stopping thinking words.
You need to pay attention to your own personal bandwidth. For example, if you're trying to reach out on social media.
So you should be able to hear that it helps the sentence that Ronnie is saying come together a little bit more. It keeps the conversation going. This allowed the podcast audio to sound a lot more cohesive. It sounded like one complete thought. And again, there's nothing wrong with someone saying or well, but if you do have the control to help that complete thought sound even more complete and more flowing in your conversation, you're only going to be doing your podcast a better service. You can check out more great videos over here on our YouTube. You can subscribe to us, like this video, let us know in the comments what else you'd like to see, and we'll see you next time for the next video.